You've mentioned before working with actors, or you use a lot of acting metaphors in your work as far as the computer analogy and the screens being maximized, that it's also just the work of an actor to use those screens, that when you become aware of them, they become almost like characters that you can play or masks that you can wear in the more classical idea of acting. And as far as working with actors, or just, you can start by just talking about that metaphor that you use, but then also the business of acting is, I think, more obviously related to subtle mental, emotional, and imaginal work than a golf swing. Even though I see in what you're saying that, obviously all those things are present all the time, but these more out there concepts are pretty directly applied daily in acting.
Yeah. It obviously gets back to the Shakespeare, all the world's a stage idea, and the idea that all these different identities, masks, characters, personas, that none of them are our actual self, right? None of them are the real self. There's that thing that's happened recently where Jim Carrey played
Mighty Mouse. No, what's his name?
What? But who's the guy that he played? Andy Kaufman.
That's it, yeah.
And I think the movie is called Man on the Moon, and that he went so far into that character of being Andy Kaufman that he had this experience where he realized that the character of Andy Kaufman was no less real, so to speak, than the character of Jim Carrey was. And he became aware that actually neither of them are real. That what previously was the real person, which was Jim Carrey, and now he was playing this pretend character, Andy Kaufman. He became aware that wow, they both are just indeed characters that he's played, and it left him in this empty, blank, no self experience. And this is the nature of the non-dual realization. I'm not making any statements about what kind of state Jim Carrey's in. You can certainly have a no self experience and find yourself in a pretty blank, awful existential depression state when you let go of ego identity. But what I'm getting at is that idea that whatever persona, whatever kind of persona you're in at any given moment, it's really just a character. Now, it can be authentic, it's not necessarily phony, but it's a character that exists within certain parameters, within certain contexts. The idea is it's not an ontological reality. It's a contextually dependent experience. With acting, like you're saying, there's the people are very overtly, intentionally playing with that. Right? That idea of players, I think, is in theater companies or whatever, it used to be that the actors were players. And I think that kind of says it well, that, they're playing at being, quote unquote, these different characters. And so then let's say one's versatility as an actor, it's like, well, what kind of state, what kind of persona, what dimension, what kind of energy, what kind of mental, emotional space can you embody, right? What can you go into and behave, feel, think, experience, and which ones can you not? In addition to that, it's like, okay, some people, they can just sort of, quote unquote, play themselves, so they can they can play this super rageful, angry character, and it's like some people will tell you, well, that's just how they are in real life. Anyway, they're not really doing a fantastic acting job. They're just being their asshole self, on camera. Another person maybe could really do a convincing job of being this angry, dark character, for example. But that's not what they tend to exhibit on a regular basis in their personal life. They just can run that kind of energy and go into that kind of state intentionally, but remain actually quite conscious as they're in that state. And again, in their personal life, they don't necessarily get pulled into, an unconscious enactment of that experience. They actually have a lot of control with it, and maybe are even less likely in their personal life to regress into that kind of state because of how much conscious control they have around that particular dimension. So there's a lot of variety, and it's a complex thing, obviously, but it's an interesting thing. We celebrate and idealize and romanticize actors, for example, who can go into very dark states. Al Pacino, plays, Scarface. Anthony Hopkins plays, Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah, he's who I immediately thought of.
And it's like, oh my God, these are dark, evil, terrifying characters they're playing, and these actors that seem to be able to so convincingly go into those kind of states. It's like, shouldn't we lock these people up? Aren't they isn't Anthony Hopkins really a serial killer or capable of that kind of dark thing? And it's like, no, and I'm joking, obviously, about should we lock them up? But it would kind of seem like that. It's like, instead we give them awards and celebrate them as these, put them on pedestals for their ability to be dark and evil. It's like, what is going on there? Why are we doing that? Why is that so compelling and moving? And why do we think it's a good thing? And I think a way to answer that is that it's this whole different model that I've been talking about with regard to how to deal with energy, how to deal with the unconscious energies, how to deal with archetypes, how to deal with the imaginal realm, that ideally we'd make it conscious. And when we watch, for example, Anthony Hopkins go into that kind of state, that dark state is being held by the movie, by the actor, by the other actors. The whole thing is being held so that we can look at it and experience it consciously. And so there's something actually productive, actually healing, actually awakening about the whole thing, or at least there potentially is. It's always this question of, okay, is it being framed? Is it being presented? Is it being held in a way that brings consciousness to it? Or is it just being expressed in a way that is an attempt at believing it, being overcome by it, being possessed by it, being seduced by it? Two different people can watch the same movie, and one person can have a healing, maturing, awakening experience in relation to that quote unquote darkness. Another person can be seduced and come out of it romanticizing and aligning themselves with that particular darkness. And so it's this dangerous thing. Art is very dangerous, right? It's very dangerous to bring expression to whatever it is you think of as dark or inappropriate or bad. It's like, why would we bring it up to look at it? Shouldn't we do away with it? Shouldn't we burn all the quote unquote bad books? Which is a different philosophy than, no, we should actually take a real thorough, deep, conscious look at all the bad books, right? They're two very different philosophies. Depth psychology is obviously in that second category, which is let's take a deep, thorough, conscious look at what's going on deep in our psyches versus how can we try to close the door and throw away lock it and throw away the key on our deep, dark processes. It plays out again in everything. And yes, acting is a very overt, intentional practice with this kind of stuff. My sense is the people that really love acting are really into that, beyond just like wanting to be a movie star or something, the actual activity of acting. It's something I feel like would be good if more of us did, if there was more of a kind of open venue for people to act. These days, it seems like, just like with a lot of things, it's like if you're going to try to sing or if you're going to try to act, it's like, well, what are you thinking? You're going to be a movie star versus acting. I think ideally would be this practice that we all kind of engage in and try to push our edges and talk about and relate about and try to, can we try to feel and experience things that are outside of what we would call our typical or our own sense of what an ideal self would be. We're all walking around trying to be our ideal self, whatever each individual thinks is their ideal self, kind of having rigid boundaries around letting ourselves behave, enact, play, feel, experience things that are outside of what we would consider to be ideal.
Tying it back to how it plays out within ourselves and the judgments we have of ourselves that limit our ability to interact in a lot of ways, and that acting out these unconscious states in a contained way would be helpful, right? Would be productive and would help us stop judging ourselves and stop judging others for those things we don't understand in ourselves.
Yes, I was trying to say that.
I think you did, Lance. I think you did. I think one thing to come back to at some point, I don't know if it's just like an audio glossary term, but pathologies, or like, are there irrevocable states? Like the people Anthony Hopkins is portraying, right? If that was people that do get locked up for living out the thing that he is portraying.
Are you saying what's the difference between?
Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it.
Beyond just the one person's actually behaving it in real life and the other person's pretending to behave it.
The other one's getting paid to do it.
Yeah, there's definitely better money in pretending it. So this idea of desire, right? That if that's kind of the base word, whether our culture thinks of a particular desire as acceptable or unacceptable, there's the question of control around it, right? Can we feel, acknowledge, own, be aware of a desire and not behave it, right? Not just be seduced or possessed and act on it. This is one of the big human problems, right? This idea that why do we have these desires that are apparently bad desires or inappropriate desires, or why are we in this situation where we have conflict with ourselves? So that quickly gets to a real religious kind of conversation, or it can get to a religious conversation quite quick. In psychology, there was the idea, and again, to come back to Freud, and I say Freud, and obviously there were various people at the time, but Freud is just kind of the big name. So I refer to Freud, but I really mean a kind of a certain school of thought, obviously. Nietzsche is another one right in that same category. But this idea that there was this shift as far as the general orientation being that one's inner life, so to speak, if you go back very far, there was no inner life. The inner life wasn't acknowledged or recognized as important. The outer life, the state, the religion was primary, and each individual needed to get in line with that. And what each individual had going on in their inner self, wasn't valued in nearly the same way it is today. And my understanding is that the big shift that came with the Enlightenment, the shift that came with humanism, individualism, was this idea that now what was sovereign was the individual. The individual had rights. The individual had validity. The individual had the freedom to think and feel, at least inwardly, the way that they did. And this shift that Freud made and that Nietzsche made was saying, you know what, when you look inward, you're not going to see what you hoped you'd see. Your idea of the ideal human, whatever your idea that ideal human is, when you look inward, that's not what you're going to see. And instead of feeling shame about that, which Freud and Nietzsche both said, this looking inward and feeling shame because it doesn't match the ideal is a real problem. It's really messing up humanity. We've really got to change our belief systems around this, because people aren't going to get their inner experience cleaned up and polished to look like whatever, their culture calls ideal. They were saying it's just not how it works. It's impossible to do that. The nature of reality, the nature of the human psyche is different than that. The nature of the human psyche is that the inner world is largely unconscious, and when you start to become aware of what that unconscious territory looks like, it's much, quote unquote, darker than we would hope. And actually the nature of it is that what humans fear most, what humans are most ashamed of, what humans are most tormented by, is generally what you're going to find in there. And it's like, well, geez, what an awful situation that sounds like, right? That's a pretty dark vision. And of course, it makes one think, well, why would anyone look inward? Why would anyone go deeper within themselves if that's what they're going to find? Doesn't it make more sense to stay outwardly focused, lock on to some kind of belief system or dogma or symbol or savior that keeps our attention focused there versus inward? And there is something to be said about that, right? At any given moment, that might be the thing to do. If you're in a situation where you're starting to freak out, let's say there's a crisis going on, people start descending inwardly and down and freaking out. And ideally, some person takes the helm and says, follow me. whether it's follow me out of this burning building, or follow me, I know the way out of this forest, or follow me, I know how to handle this kind of situation, or let me take over. I'm a doctor. I know how to tend to this person's wound. So there's a real place for come out of your movement inward and down into a paranoid, terrifying freakout, and orient to an outer person that can comfort you and can guide the way. We need that in various ways. So it's situationally dependent. We can get overly dependent on that. If you go to too far of an extreme, you're not looking inwardly at all, right? So you don't develop your own strengths. You don't develop your own ability to navigate this situation or that. You just stay dependent on the external structure that you're orienting to. So there's this back and forth. It's like, to what extent do you try to stand on your own 2 feet? To what extent do you explore your own self, your own inwardness, your own darkness, your own frailties? And to what extent do you block them out and stay fixated on this external thing? And Freud and Nietzsche are two big names, and of course Jung was also, who said, look, we have to understand and accept that inwardly everyone is experiencing this dark stuff. It's not that some people are all warm and fuzzy and filled with light and love and courage and strength, and other people are, bad people are filled with bad stuff. It's that in general, the unconscious is bad. The unconscious is primitive. The unconscious is psychotic even. And we got to try to contend with that. We got to try to figure out how to organize that, how to harness that, how to make that conscious. And of course, in general, Freud's general idea was we just need to make it conscious, and then kind of come to terms with it and accept it, that we all have this dark, weird, twisted inner self, and we just bring it to the surface and kind of recognize it for what it is. Jung said we got to dive deep enough into it to where it actually transmutes, to where it actually changes, and we discover spirit in the midst of it. Nietzsche said we need to just keep going deeper into the darkness until we penetrate it and arrive at the Superman experience, which would be obviously analogous to Jung saying arriving at spirit. And that general model, my sense is our society has gotten away from it. We've moved in a direction away from that, to where we're more and more seeing human behavior as purely a social construct, seeing reality as purely a social construct, and thinking that we can rationally decide on what the correct way to think and feel is, and then enforce that correct way by demonizing and canceling anybody who isn't in alignment with that idea about what is ideal. And I think it's a real dangerous thing to do, because I don't think it really works that way. I think that is programming as opposed to deprogramming. I think that's a movement towards possession, a movement towards unconsciousness as opposed to consciousness. Again, I can't remember what the question was.
I think that was it. I think it's just a different podcast. That was the question. I think that's the question was about pathologies and like what's irrevocable or what is outside the boundaries of what's possible. And I think what you're saying is that it's not really the way to look at it.
Just that idea that this stuff is in us, and life can make it erupt. And when life makes it erupt, for example, if you're hit with a traumatic experience, right, you can certain experiences will make certain energies move. They'll make certain dimensions show up on your mind screen, whether you ever wanted them to or not. And then the question is, how overcome, how possessed, how seduced are you when that happens? When someone kills your loved one, how are you going to deal with the rage? How are you going to deal with the terror? How are you going to deal with the grief? When you get violated in a way that makes you want to kill, what do you do with that? What do you do with that murderous rage you have? What do you do when suicidal thoughts start flooding your mind? What are you supposed to do when we don't understand that these things happen? Good people have bad stuff flood their mind. And what do you do when bad stuff floods your mind? How do you deal with it? And just saying that's bad doesn't stop it from flooding the mind. It just makes the person feel ashamed and isolated. So to have an approach where you say, I see and understand and feel that you're having this bad stuff flood your mind. And it's okay. It's not unique to you. You're not the bad one. Everybody has this in them. And this stuff that's flooding your mind and making you feel bad about yourself or bad about life or bad about others or making you want to behave in a way that's destructive. The first thing that needs to happen, and again, this Freud was saying this, is that it needs to be given space to be looked at consciously. It needs to be accepted. It needs to not be looked at with a lens that simply judges it. It needs to be given a space to come out into the open so that it can be dealt with and worked with. And that's a huge thing. There's a huge difference between those two ways of approaching something. And even if you're on board with it seeming like a good idea to bring consciousness to it and give it space and look at it and deal with it that way, it's easier said than done. It's easier said than done. And we all are in a situation where there's certain stuff we can give conscious space to, and there's certain stuff we just cannot. And in ways that we cannot, then we need help. I can only bring conscious awareness to certain stuff, and other stuff I can't. You can only bring conscious awareness to certain stuff, other stuff you can't. A particular society is only bringing conscious awareness to certain stuff, not others. We're having a situation right now, obviously, in our society where there is there's obviously stuff being brought up to the surface. And there are certain people, for example, that are saying, this has got to be looked at. This has to be looked at in a more thorough, conscious, intentional way, rather than push back down under the surface. And it's always this question of, is it going to just erupt into an enactment of the unconscious stuff, the unconscious rage, the unconscious hatred? Is it just going to be judged as bad, or can it be held space for, understood, empathized with, and harnessed in a way that it can be productive, which of course involves a conscious gaze as opposed to just an unconscious reactive gaze?
It's gonna do all those things at once, right? It's going to, when it's a social limit to the amount of space that could be given, it's going to be responded to differently by different people or different groups.
Right.
It gets back to that idea we were talking about as far as the notion of a community outside yourself, or of a tribe, or of a a group outside yourself that would contain something that you couldn't personally, and the lack of that kind of space for a lot of people to begin with.
Yeah, right.
If you want to learn more about the Dimension Approach, please visit dimensionapproach.com.